Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Yvette Nolan and MacKinnon's play Death of a Chief, which I'm reading in the collection The Shakespeare's Mine, edited by Rick Knowles. So, Knowles calls this, and for the purposes of this video, I'm calling this Nolan and MacKinnon's Death of a Chief. But it was actually developed in a workshop with a number of theater artists, performers, actors, etc., through Native Earth Performing Arts. Now, Nolan and MacKinnon kind of led those workshops, but they were genuinely collaborative processes in which a group of indigenous First Nations and Métis theater artists worked out what exactly they wanted in this play, which is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar put into a First Nations Canadian context. It's one of the things that's really interesting about the adaptation is that almost all of the text is in fact Shakespeare's text. So this hasn't particularly been rewritten, even though the performance is dramatically different than, I don't even want to say a typical presentation of Shakespeare, because I don't really think that there is such a thing as a typical presentation of Shakespeare nowadays. I mean, I've seen Caesar done in a couple of different ways. I've seen Caesar done very much in a sort of fascist kind of almost World War II type aesthetic with like leather trench coats and things like this. I've seen Caesar done at the Royal Shakespeare Company with this sort of barbarian splendor, Conan the Barbarian type aesthetic. So I don't think there's I think critics, particularly theater critics who responded to Death of a Chief and were like, oh, it's not indigenous enough, I, as the white theater critics say, or I don't think Caesar lends itself to discussing indigenous issues, which were things that critics said, which is bullshit, by the way. But like, when white theater companies do experimental things with Shakespeare, there's much more of a willingness to sort of say, yes, I can see what they're doing, whereas when Native Earth Performing Arts, which is Canada's sort of longest running and probably most prestigious indigenous theater and performance company, when they did Death of a Chief, there was a lot of pushback against it, which to me doesn't make that much sense, because I actually think it's a brilliantly done reworking of the play. And I'm going to stop with the metacriticism now and talk more about the play itself and what Nolan and MacKinnon and the workshop members at Native Earth Performing Arts did with the play. So, as I said, much of the text of Death of a Chief comes directly from Julius Caesar, even to the point where, like, they haven't necessarily modernized the spelling. So, so the first real line, I'm actually going to tell you about what we start with, and we do have a bit by the Oracle, who speaks an Ojibwe translation, and I'm going to talk more about that as well. But apart from that, the first line we get that's untranslated Shakespeare is Brutus. What means this shouting? And the spelling here, WHATMEANES THIS SHOWTING. So this is like when I've performed Shakespeare in the past, and I've been in a production of The Tempest, for instance, we used a script that modernized the spelling, that regularized the spelling. The Native Earth Performing Arts version here is in a more original spelling. Now, this is always a little bit contentious because with Shakespeare you have different manuscripts, you have different folios, quartos, things like this. And the spelling is not regularized in the early modern period, but they're embracing that. So I think that's actually a really interesting component. But they're also putting this in... They're putting this in a contemporary indigenous context, an urban indigenous context. And one of the things that goes with that is that this is a sort of pan-tribal or pan-Indian or even pan-indigenous performance. So while most of the language is Shakespeare's, there are bits and pieces that are translated into First Nations languages. So, for instance, after the death of Caesar, but before Brutus's speech trying to explain the motives of the conspirators, the plebeians say, "We will be satisfied, let us be satisfied." And then they repeat that in Kuna. And I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I don't speak any of these First Nations languages. Even though it's written out here, I'd pronounce it wrong and I don't want to do that. Then Cassius has a line, and the plebeians repeat the same line, "We will be satisfied, let us be satisfied," in Mohawk. Then Brutus has 5 lines, and the plebeians repeat the same thing in Ojibwe. So we have here a clearly multicultural, multilinguistic group of Romans, because the plebeians are the sort of average citizens of Rome. And then shortly after that, things get even more diverse. After Antony makes his famous "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears" speech, we have a stage direction here that says, "The plebeians have arranged themselves on stage, looking out at the audience. During Antony's speech, they begin to dance his prophecy. They pull the rocks from their pockets, stab the air, lunge. The dance disintegrates into a civil war, brother against sister, citizen against citizen. By the end of Antony's speech, all are singing a war song. It is an adapted haka with echoes of a yoik." And I don't know if I'm pronouncing yoik right. But the haka is a traditional Maori or Polynesian war song. And the yoik is a Sami song. So the Maori are the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, and the Sami are indigenous peoples of the Arctic Circle, particularly in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. But I think also a lot of Sami live in Russia as well. So, again, in this sense, this is a sort of pan-indigenous aesthetic. And a little bit later, after Antony finishes his next speech, after Antony finishes her next speech, because that's actually another thing that Native Earth Performing Arts does, is they switch the genders of most of the characters. So Brutus is the only one of the major figures, actually I guess Brutus and Portia are the only ones of the major figures who retain the gender that they have in Shakespeare. So Caesar is played by a female performer, Mark Antony is played by a female performer, Cassius is played by a female performer, etc., etc. So Antony makes her next speech, the one that begins, "O pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth." And then after that, she begins to perform a haka as well. And Caesar, according to the stage direction, Caesar rises and assumes the stance of a warrior, joins the haka. So that's interesting in itself, again, because we have this intercultural experience. And one of the reasons that's significant is because a major challenge facing Indigenous peoples in Canada is that so many have been dispossessed of their lands and their traditional territories. And because they've very often been confined to small reservations without sufficient access to fishing, farming, hunting, etc., to live traditional lifestyles, but also without access to economic opportunities, many Indigenous people have gone to the cities, gone to major urban centers. And there they tend to lose direct links to their own nation's cultures. So if you're Algonquin, for instance, and you move to Ottawa, you may be living in the same neighborhood as Cree, as Ojibwe, as Mohawk. You may be living in the same area as people who are, while they're all Indigenous, while they're all from First Nations, they're not from the same First Nation, so they don't have the same cultural background that you do, even if they're closely related. And so what tends to happen in the cities is that pan-Indian or pan-Indigenous cultures become increasingly the cultural context. And in fact, for Death of a Chief, that was the case. They have the people who workshopped this had different backgrounds. Again, Cree, Ojibwe, Nolan herself is half Irish and half Algonquin. So you have all of these different styles, backgrounds, aesthetics, cultures blending in together to create a new type of sort of unified culture. And we actually have a reference here in this speech, again, the one that starts, "O thou bleeding piece of earth," when Antony says, "A curse shall light upon the limbs of men, domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Canada." And of course, Shakespeare didn't say Canada in his version. But we have, again, this sense that this is a particular Indigenous approach, and that Canada is implicated in this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the opening of the play, because this is the one place we have a really distinct extended period that deviates from what Shakespeare did. So it's a ritualized performance opening, and I'm going to read you a somewhat lengthy bit of the stage directions here, and then a bit from a little bit later on. So the play starts. A medicine wheel, a circle of stones laid in the middle of a road somewhere. The horizon is butter-colored. The wheel is 22 stones or so. 13 of them make the circle, and another 9 make the spokes within the wheel. In the low light the stones throw long shadows. A drum begins and the lights fade. In the darkness we hear a low double thrum, the heartbeat of the very earth, 5 times. With the final badum, the lights warm, revealing human forms in the places where there were only rocks before. Here a woman, here a man, here another woman. 9 human forms curled around their rocks. 9 human forms that wake now, moving from fetal position to child's pose, still covering their rocks. Pulling themselves onto their knees, the people begin to sweep the ground around their rocks. One by one they execute a series of gestures, raising their rocks to the sky, rocking them like children. One by one they struggle to all fours, and then they stand. Standing they draw a half circle in the earth. One by one they come to stillness, arms extended in circle. They see each other. Someone begins to dance. Suddenly all are dancing, each in his or her own way. There is no sound, no fiddle, no drum, yet here are the stately traditional dances of the women, the Métis jig, the grass dance, and then there is sound. One voice begins to sing and is joined by another. And so they start singing indigenous songs, or variations of indigenous songs. And we have various songs sung here, various dances performed here, all sort of oriented around this medicine wheel of rocks laid out on the stage. And then toward the end of this portion, it says, the rabbit dance song ends and the people lay their silk down in the middle of the road. Also, there's colored banners that people sort of periodically pull down and use those large pieces of silk as props. And the people lay the silk down in the middle of the road. At the upstage left end of the silk, one prepares to step onto the red road. She is stately and imposing. As she goes to step onto the road, a young man blocks her way, catching her foot before she can set it on the road. He is the young man who pulled down the red silk. He is the oracle. And then in Ojibwe, we have a colloquial translation, as it says here in the footnote. He says, how many ages hence shall our lofty scene be acted over in state unborn and accents yet unknown? So that's the first spoken language of the play, is these famous lines from Julius Caesar translated into Ojibwe, which of course was a language that William Shakespeare would not have known existed when he wrote the play. And then the stage direction says, but it is too late, for always she is Caesar. She pushes the oracle who falls away from her, and she sets her foot down on the road. And so in that sense, we have again a play that is fundamentally concerned with these same kinds of questions that Shakespeare is concerned with, but they're concerned with them in an indigenous or reservation context. Who are our leaders? How do we choose our leaders? What do we do when a leader is not acting in our best interest? And things like this. So, but again, this is all relocated into Rome, Ontario, Canada, and it's worked out through a set of Indigenous and First Nations cultures that have been victims of detrimental colonial violence.